contrast, anti-traditional dead architecture includes practices that criticize this approach and develop alternative methods. The traditional dead architecture movement questions the exclusion of concepts such as emotion, care, and collaborative production elements, often deemed feminine. Famous architects like Mies van der Rohe, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Le Corbusier were glorified not only for their designs but also for their masculine identities. This has reinforced the perception of architecture as a rigid, rational, and a serious profession. According to Anderson, architects should move away from simply copying the past and instead absorb and interpret the special, social, and political dimensions of a given era. When we consider how the traditional dead style excludes care, emotion, empathy, and user-centered design, imposing instead a male-dominated and rationalist architectural mindset, it becomes clear how questionable and problematic this legacy truly is. In feminist architecture, emotions and empathy, often devalued due to being perceived as feminine, are not only seen as a part of the final product, but also as integral to the design process and the relationship established with the user. In other words, emotions are not just about how a building makes us feel, they're also tied to how, with whom, and why that building is produced. Feminist architecture argues that building a dialogue with the user is a vital aspect of design. Similarly, Anderson believes this kind of dialogue should also be established with the past, not by treating it as a collection of aesthetic elements to be imitated, but by engaging with it critically and thoughtfully, interpreting it in a way that allows for the creation of something new and original.
Peter Eisenman's phrase "the end of the classical" shows a break in architectural history, both in thinking and in form. Classical architecture isn't only a style but also a long-lasting way of thinking in Western culture, where meaning is based on order, center, and proportion. In this system, architecture always represents something, an identity, an ideology, or a universal order. Eisenman says that this approach started in ancient Greece and continued until modernism, and that modern architecture, even if it seems to reject the classical, still carries its basic elements. Eisenman explained the break of this continuity in two stages: the end of the beginning and the end of the end.
The end of the beginning means the time when the classical structure inside modernism starts to break. In this period, architects offer alternatives to classical meaning using values like functionality, simplicity, and technology, but the effort to create meaning in architecture still continues. However, with the postmodern period, this effort is also left behind. This is the end of the end. Now, architecture does not have to create or represent meaning. Its job can be only about form, process, and inner logic. This idea is a strong challenge to the idea of continuity in architectural history. According to Eisenman, architecture is no longer based on a timeline connected to the past, but is made of breaks, gaps, and rewritings.
Stanford Anderson and Peter Eisenman are two important thinkers who have different ideas about how we understand the meaning of buildings. Their ideas help us think about how architecture is done and what it means to us. Stanford Anderson thinks it's important to look at old ways of building. He says that what people did in the past can give us ideas for today's problems in architecture, but we shouldn't just build like they did before. We need to think carefully about those old ways and change them to fit what we need now. For Anderson, good architecture is when people think deeply and are creative. It's not just about following the latest trends or only knowing the technical parts of building. He believes that the meaning of architecture comes from this thoughtful and creative process. Peter Eisenman has a different idea about how architecture got its meaning over time. He says that for a long time, certain ideas have made it hard for us to see architecture in new ways. These ideas are things like what buildings represent or show, how we use our minds to understand them, and the history of buildings. Eisenman believes that these old ideas can stop architecture from having its own unique meaning. He doesn't like it when people say that new buildings should always look like old ones. He also points out that even when modern architecture tries to be only about being useful, it still creates new kinds of meaning. For Eisenman, architecture is also about thinking deeply about concepts and ideas, not just about constructing buildings. The main difference between Anderson and Eisenman is how they view the past. Anderson thinks the past can be helpful for modern architecture if we think about it in a smart and critical way.
Eisenman, however, believes that the past and old ways of thinking can prevent architecture from finding its own true meaning. But both of them agree that architecture is more than just putting up walls and roofs. It also involves careful thoughts, questioning, and the creation of meaning. In conclusion, Anderson's idea of thoughtfully looking at the tradition and Eisenman's idea of architecture having its own inherent meaning offer us different ways to understand how buildings get their meaning. These different viewpoints remind us that architecture is not just about making places, but also about creating meaning in our minds, in our culture, and throughout history. These discussions help us to keep thinking and talking about what architecture truly means.
Peter Eastman believes that architecture shouldn't depend on history or traditional ideas. He wants to create forms that are based on their own internal rules and logic, not on what people expect. His work often looks very different and strange because he tries to break away from normal ideas about buildings. Stanford Anderson, however, thinks that tradition is very important for architecture. He says that architecture should study and understand history deeply. For Anderson, tradition is not about copying old buildings, but about learning from them and thinking carefully about how to use that knowledge in new ways.
Even though Eastman and Anderson have very different opinions, it is possible to find some common ground. Both Eastman and Anderson believe that architecture should not be simple or shallow. They both think that architecture should make people think and feel something deeper. While Eastman focuses on form and structure and Anderson focuses on meaning and history, they both want architecture to be intelligent and truthful. So even if they take different paths, their goals are similar. In this way, we can say their ideas can be reconciled a little bit. In my opinion, architects today should build open historical presence rather than completely break from them. History is very rich and full of important lessons. When architects study the past, they can understand how buildings were designed to solve real problems. They can also learn about materials, techniques, and cultural values that make all buildings special.
If architects ignore history, they might repeat old mistakes or create buildings that do not fit well with their environment or culture. Also, history can inspire architects to find new ideas by looking at how people lived and built before. However, I also believe that architects should not only copy historical styles, they should use history as a strong foundation, but then create something new and meaningful for today's world. Architecture must evolve with time because the needs of society change. By building upon history, architects can make designs that are both modern and respectful of the past. This creates buildings that people can connect with because they feel familiar and new at the same time. It also helps cities and communities stay strong and beautiful for future generations.